In the quiet heart of Florida, back in 1847, a small settlement called Rosewood was founded. At first, it was a mixed-race community, families of both black and white residents living side by side. People worked in the local timber and pencil industries, carving out a modest living from the cedar trees that surrounded the town. For a while, life in Rosewood seemed ordinary, almost unremarkable, like countless other rural towns across the South. But as the industries declined by the late 1800s and many white families moved away, Rosewood gradually became a predominantly black town. This shift gave Rosewood a unique identity. It was more than just a place on the map. It became a rare haven for black families in an era when racial segregation and prejudice defined much of American life. Here, residents raised their children, built churches, and supported one another. They took pride in their independence, cultivating a community that could stand on its own despite the hostile racial climate outside its borders. For those who lived there, Rosewood represented peace, self-reliance, and hope for a better future. But beneath this tranquility, America was still haunted by the shadow of racial violence. Across the South in the early 20th century, lynchings and racially motivated attacks were tragically common. Any accusation, rumor, or misunderstanding could ignite an inferno of mob violence. Rosewood's very existence as a prosperous black community stood as a challenge to the toxic racial hierarchy of the time. And in 1923, one accusation would unleash devastation that wiped the town off the map. The story of Rosewood is not just a local tragedy. It is a reminder of how fragile peace can be when hatred and prejudice are allowed to spread unchecked. A single spark can turn into a wildfire when fueled by fear, suspicion, and bigotry. Rosewood's destruction was not the result of a natural disaster or war. It was man-made, born from lies and inflamed by racism. In this video, we will journey back to Rosewood. We will uncover how a once thriving community became the target of one of the darkest racial massacres in American history. We will meet the families who lived there, hear the stories passed down by survivors, and explore how this tragedy was buried for decades before finally coming to light. This is not an easy story to tell, but it is a necessary one, because by remembering Rosewood, we confront the uncomfortable truths about America's past, and we ensure that the voices silenced by violence are heard once more. If you believe history should never be forgotten, and if you want to help bring more hidden stories like this to light, please take a moment to like this video, share it with others, and subscribe to the channel. Your support helps us continue to tell stories that matter, stories that challenge us to reflect, to learn, and to build a future where tragedies like Rosewood are never repeated. At the edge of Florida's quiet Gulf Coast, the town of Rosewood carried with it a story unlike most others in the post-Civil War South. Founded in the mid-19th century, it was born as a place of opportunity, first for a mixed community of settlers and then, over time, for African American families who were determined to carve out lives of dignity and independence in an era that often sought to deny them both. By the 1890s, when the local industries that had once attracted diverse groups of settlers began to fade, Rosewood gradually transformed into a predominantly black settlement. For those who lived there, the decline of the mills and the factories did not mean despair, but rather a chance to build something more enduring, rooted not in outside economic forces but in family, resilience, and the strength of a tightly woven community. The people of Rosewood were no strangers to adversity. They lived through decades where the shadow of slavery lingered long after emancipation, where laws and attitudes often worked against their progress. Yet, within the boundaries of their own town, they cultivated a sense of stability and belonging that was rare for African Americans in the South during the early 20th century. They built churches that rang with hope on Sundays, schools where children learned not just their letters, but also the meaning of perseverance, and businesses that circulated money within their own neighborhood. Families tilled gardens, raised livestock, and established modest but solid homes. The town did not grow wealthy, but it was steady, and that steadiness gave people something that was often denied to them elsewhere: a sense of pride in where they lived and who they were. What made Rosewood so remarkable during this period was the way its residents nurtured each other in spite of the broader climate of hostility that surrounded them. Throughout much of the South, the rise of segregation, discriminatory laws, and widespread acts of intimidation threatened to strip African Americans of their sense of safety and belonging. Yet in Rosewood, neighbors knew they could rely on one another. If a roof needed fixing, hands arrived to help. If a child struggled in school, an older student or teacher would sit down to guide them. Weddings, funerals, harvests, and church gatherings all tied the town together, weaving a fabric of community that was difficult to tear. In the early 1900s, the town had developed a rhythm that blended tradition with aspiration. Parents taught their children to respect hard work, but they also planted in them the dream that one day life could be different, that the world beyond Rosewood might recognize their worth. This belief was not naive, it was grounded in the daily evidence of what their own hands had built. Rosewood may not have had grandeur, but it had resilience, and in many ways that resilience was more precious than wealth. The town's relative peace and orderliness were striking because they stood in such contrast to the realities of the wider South. In an era when violence and discrimination were often used to reinforce racial hierarchies, Rosewood quietly resisted, not through confrontation, but by demonstrating what was possible when people focused on growth instead of division. Children laughed on dirt roads, elders told stories of survival and triumph, and families gathered for Sunday dinners where food was scarce at times but joy was abundant. This was not to say that the people of Rosewood were unaware of the risks they faced outside their community. Travel could be dangerous, opportunities were limited, and prejudice often lurked just beyond the borders of town. But within Rosewood, there was a prevailing sense of order and dignity. It was this balance, this mix of caution and confidence that allowed the town to flourish in its own quiet way. The story of Rosewood in these years is one of a community standing firm in the face of uncertainty, holding on to what mattered most: family, faith, and mutual support. Even when industries collapsed and opportunities dwindled, the people refused to scatter or surrender. They chose instead to invest in each other, and in doing so, they built something stronger than brick or timber. They built a legacy of resilience. As we explore the journey of Rosewood, we are reminded that history is not only about great battles or political leaders. It is also about the everyday lives of people who dared to dream of stability in a time when so much was unstable, who created spaces of belonging when the world outside seemed determined to push them aside. Their story challenges us to reflect on what truly makes a community thrive and to recognize the quiet strength in those who simply refuse to give up. Rosewood, in the years before it would be tested by events that shook its very foundations, was not just a dot on the map of Florida. It was a beacon of perseverance, a testament to what people could achieve together despite the weight of history pressing against them. It stood as living proof that even in difficult times, determination and solidarity could create a home where dignity flourished. And it is within that spirit of resilience that we continue to uncover the deeper lessons of Rosewood's past. Lessons that still hold meaning for us today. Across the U.S., lynching and white supremacist violence against black people were rampant in the early 20th century. And it cast a dark shadow over communities like Rosewood that had worked so hard to build stability despite the odds. To understand the tension of that era, one must imagine a nation that had formally abolished slavery but still carried the scars of its legacy, where freedom on paper was constantly undermined by systemic exclusion, racial terror, and laws designed to enforce separation. Rosewood, with its churches, schools, and thriving small businesses, was in many ways a symbol of resilience, but its very success made it a target. Communities that managed to carve out spaces of independence often provoked resentment from neighboring white populations who saw any sign of black prosperity as a challenge to a deeply entrenched hierarchy. This climate was not unique to Florida. Across the country, there were countless examples of prosperous black neighborhoods becoming focal points for hostility. In the South especially, the shadow of violence was ever present. Lynchings, often committed publicly and sometimes even treated as community spectacles, were designed to do more than harm individuals. They were orchestrated to send a message of fear, to reinforce the idea that success or confidence could be punished without consequence. For families living in places like Rosewood, the awareness of these dangers was inescapable. Even children grew up hearing stories whispered by parents and neighbors. Warnings about what might happen if one was in the wrong place at the wrong time, or if a false accusation spread unchecked. Despite this looming threat, Rosewood's people carried on with remarkable courage. They continued to invest in education, knowing that literacy and learning were among the most powerful tools for long-term survival and dignity. Churches remained central, offering not only faith and comfort, but also a gathering place where strategies for mutual aid and protection could be quietly discussed. Shops and small enterprises thrived, showing that, even in a hostile climate, black communities could sustain themselves economically. But with every achievement came the underlying risk that those successes might spark resentment among outsiders. For many white residents in nearby towns, the idea that their black neighbors could own land, run businesses, and send their children to school was something they could not accept, and that intolerance festered beneath the surface of daily life. Nationally, newspapers sometimes covered these eruptions of violence in sensational terms, but more often, the stories of black suffering went underreported or were twisted in ways that placed blame on the victims themselves. This lack of accountability emboldened those who carried out acts of terror, because they knew the likelihood of being arrested, let alone convicted, was slim. It created an environment where justice was applied unevenly, where the rights of one group were upheld while the safety of another was constantly in jeopardy. Rosewood residents, like others across the country, lived with that knowledge every day, making their persistence all the more remarkable. The early 20th century was also a time of mass migration for many African Americans, who left the South in search of better opportunities in northern and Midwestern cities. Yet not everyone could leave, nor did everyone want to abandon the land their families had worked so hard to claim. For those who remained, the act of staying was itself a form of quiet defiance. Rosewood embodied that spirit. Families chose to build and root themselves in a place they believed could sustain them, even though they were aware of the dangers. They invested in the idea that community and solidarity might be enough to withstand whatever hostility surrounded them. The reality, however, was that violence in the early 1900s was not just random. It was systemic, and it followed a grim pattern. A rumor, a fabricated accusation, or a minor incident could escalate quickly into an excuse for brutality. The mere suggestion of impropriety by a black man toward a white woman, whether true or not, was often enough to ignite deadly consequences. This volatile combination of racial prejudice and mob mentality was like a fire waiting for a spark, and it was the backdrop against which Rosewood's story unfolded. The people of Rosewood knew their lives were lived under a constant threat, but to retreat or abandon their homes was to surrender to the very forces that sought to control them. Even in the face of such uncertainty, moments of everyday life persisted: children playing in fields, shopkeepers greeting neighbors, church bells ringing on Sunday mornings. These ordinary scenes stood in stark contrast to the extraordinary risks surrounding them. The existence of Rosewood was a testament to human determination, the refusal to let fear erase culture, family, and progress. But the wider American story of that time was one in which countless similar communities lived under siege, their futures always uncertain, because they were trapped within a nation that preached equality but practiced division. As the 20th century moved forward, the national conversation about race did not ease the tensions that places like Rosewood experienced. Instead, each new decade seemed to carry its own challenges, and the fragile balance between survival and destruction remained. To look back now is to recognize how precarious life was for Black Americans in that period, how the promise of freedom was constantly undermined by terror, and how communities like Rosewood bore the weight of both their hopes and their fears. Their perseverance, even amid constant danger, is not just a chapter of history, but a profound reminder of the human will to create and sustain life in the face of overwhelming adversity. On the morning of January 1st, 1923, the town of Rosewood, Florida, stirred awake much like any other small southern community. Families prepared for church services, children played in the dusty lanes, and the new year carried with it both hope and the unspoken weight of old divisions. Beneath the surface of this seemingly quiet town lay a fragile balance between its Black residents, who had built a thriving community through resilience and determination, and their white neighbors, whose views were often shaped by the rigid racial hierarchies of the time. Into this fragile equilibrium burst a story that would shatter lives and send ripples far beyond the pine forests of Levy County. It began with an accusation made by a young white woman named Fannie Taylor. She lived in Sumner, a nearby town not far from Rosewood, and on that New Year's morning, she claimed that she had been assaulted in her home by a Black man whose identity she did not know. Her face bore marks that told a story, but the truth behind those marks remains obscured even today. Some whispered then, and historians continue to believe, that her claim may have been a desperate attempt to hide the reality of a troubled personal life, perhaps even an affair with a white man that had spiraled into violence. But in the climate of the South in the 1920s, her explanation was not taken as a private matter. It became tinder for a fire already smoldering. News of her accusation spread swiftly, fanned by word of mouth and the local press, until it became something far larger than one woman's story. In a region where racial tensions simmered constantly, her words acted as a spark that tapped into a dangerous reservoir of fear, resentment, and prejudice. White men in the surrounding towns were quick to seize upon the narrative, ignoring the lack of evidence or corroboration, and instead feeding into a familiar and destructive script that cast suspicion on all Black men as potential threats. The story was no longer about Fannie Taylor alone. It became a rallying cry, a justification for anger, and a license for violence. In Rosewood, the Black residents had no voice in the conversation that now concerned them so deeply. Families who had lived and worked there for generations suddenly found themselves the targets of rumor and suspicion. Men who had built homes with their own hands, who had cut timber from the surrounding forests, and who had taught their children to read and write in small, one-room schoolhouses, now had to listen as whispers turned into threats. The knowledge of what could follow was not abstract. They were living in a time when stories of racial violence from other parts of the South were passed around with terrifying regularity. Each lynching, each act of terror, was a reminder that the protections of the law were thin at best when weighed against white anger. As the hours passed that day, white posses began to organize, their numbers swelling with each retelling of Taylor's accusation. What began as a claim of a single assailant quickly morphed into something much larger in their imaginations. The search for a suspect became an excuse to terrorize, and soon Rosewood was no longer simply a neighboring town but a target. For the men of these posses, the boundaries between guilt and innocence blurred into irrelevance. Their fury was not about justice, but about enforcing dominance in the old and brutal way. Within Rosewood itself, families faced the growing dread with a mix of courage and fear. Some tried to believe that the storm might pass, that perhaps the truth would reveal itself and cooler heads would prevail. Others recognized that the pattern was too familiar, and that once the machinery of accusation and mob violence began to move, it was nearly impossible to stop. Parents whispered hurriedly to their children to stay close. Mothers prepared what food and belongings they could in case they needed to flee. And the entire community held its breath as the new year opened, not with celebration, but with the heavy anticipation of danger. The most tragic part of this story lies not only in what followed, but in how quickly the lines between reality and rumor dissolved. Taylor's accusation, whether rooted in fear, shame, or deception, became the foundation upon which an entire community's safety and dignity were placed on trial. The very absence of proof was overshadowed by the willingness of others to believe the worst and to act upon it. The accusation was not just about one man or one woman, it became the catalyst for exposing the deep fractures in American society, where the lives of black families could be undone by the fragile words of a single claim. As night fell on January 1, 1923, Rosewood was no longer simply waiting. Word had spread far enough that groups of armed white men were preparing to descend. While the residents of the black community braced themselves for what they feared was inevitable. What had started in the walls of Fannie Taylor's home now threatened to engulf an entire town. For the people of Rosewood, the year that had only just begun would soon become a crucible of survival, a test of how far a community's strength could withstand the weight of lies, prejudice, and rage unleashed. And so, with each passing hour after that first accusation, Rosewood edged closer to tragedy. The story of that day reminds us how quickly rumor can harden into violence, and how the fragile peace of a community can collapse when prejudice is given license to rule unchecked. What happened in Rosewood was not inevitable, but it was made possible by the social climate of the time, by the ease with which truth could be sacrificed for anger, and by the readiness of a mob to take justice into its own hands. It was a beginning, but for many in Rosewood, it would soon mark an ending that the world would not easily forget. Despite her statement denying rape, the story that had already begun to spread was far more potent than any truth she might have offered. And in the tense climate of the Deep South during the early 1920s, truth often carried less weight than rumor. Word traveled quickly, twisting and growing with each retelling, until the version that settled into the minds of many was one that played perfectly into the most dangerous fears and prejudices of the era. Fannie Taylor's denial did little to stop the rising tide of outrage because by then, the image of a black man accused of violating a white woman had already taken root in the imagination of the community. In the South, such accusations had historically been enough to spark violence, riots, and collective acts of retribution, whether or not there was evidence. That night and in the days that followed, Rosewood, a small, predominantly black town with a proud history and deep roots, would become the stage for one of the darkest episodes of racial violence in American history. The whispers of what had supposedly happened to Fannie Taylor spread beyond her home and into the streets of Sumner, then into the surrounding areas. Each telling was more exaggerated than the last, and as the tale shifted, it transformed from a story of an assault with no clear evidence into one of a supposed brutal crime that cried out, in the eyes of the white mob, for immediate vengeance. Many of those who fueled the rumors were not interested in finding the truth, but instead found an excuse, wrapped in the guise of moral outrage, to unleash their aggression against a black community that had been thriving despite the weight of segregation and systemic oppression. The accusation became less about Fannie Taylor herself and more about maintaining a social order rooted in racial dominance. Rosewood's residents were no strangers to hostility. They had endured the challenges of living in a segregated society, where even small successes often bred resentment among their white neighbors. Families there had built homes, established businesses, and fostered a community that reflected resilience and determination. But their stability rested on fragile ground, And when the mob began to organize, the very existence of Rosewood was threatened. The idea that a black man had supposedly committed a crime against a white woman gave those in power all the justification they felt they needed to erase the town's progress. As tensions escalated, men gathered in groups, armed and restless, their anger stoked not by facts but by hearsay and prejudice. Leaders of the mob spoke in fiery tones, calling for retribution, insisting that Rosewood harbored the man responsible, though there was no evidence and no suspect identified. The community was placed under a blanket of suspicion simply because of the color of its residents' skin. In the eyes of the mob, it no longer mattered what Fannie Taylor had actually said. What mattered was the narrative they chose to believe, a narrative that turned neighbors into enemies and fear into justification for bloodshed. The tragedy of Rosewood began not with fire or gunfire, but with this insidious distortion of truth. It is chilling to consider how quickly rumors can overpower facts, how easily prejudice can transform a denial into a declaration of guilt. What happened in Rosewood is not merely a story about an accusation. It is a story about how communities, once inflamed by bigotry, can lose sight of humanity altogether. The mob's outrage was not truly about protecting Fannie Taylor, nor was it about justice. It was about control, about reminding black citizens that no matter how hard they worked, how respectable they were, or how prosperous their town became, their safety and dignity could be stripped away in an instant if it suited the desires of their white neighbors. As the sun set on the first day of 1923, the town of Rosewood stood unaware of the storm about to descend upon it. Families gathered in their homes, perhaps aware of the rumors but still holding on to hope that reason might prevail, that cooler heads might stop the fury before it consumed everything. But history has shown that once such fires are lit, they are nearly impossible to extinguish. By the time the mob grew to its full size, with outsiders streaming in from nearby towns eager to participate, Rosewood was already marked as a target. The story of an alleged assault, though denied by the very woman at the center of it, had given rise to a campaign of terror that would destroy lives, shatter families, and leave scar-lasting generations. The heartbreaking reality is that Fannie Taylor's denial could not compete with the hunger for a scapegoat. Her voice was drowned out by the shouts of those who sought to turn rumor into action. In this, Rosewood became a symbol of the power of lies, of the consequences of prejudice left unchecked. It showed how a single accusation, true or not, could ignite hatred so fierce that it consumed an entire community. This is why the story of Rosewood remains important today. It is a reminder of the dangers of rumor, the fragility of truth, and the devastating price that is paid when hatred is allowed to masquerade as justice. In the end, Rosewood was not undone by what Fannie Taylor said or did not say, but by the choices of those who preferred vengeance over truth. And it is in that choice, repeated too often in history, that we find one of the most haunting lessons of the American past. That when lies are allowed to thrive, when hatred is given free rein, innocent lives will always be the first to suffer. The fear and anger that swept through the community did not remain contained within whispers or private suspicions. As the story of an alleged attack spread, people searched for someone to blame, someone upon whom they could project all their fury and resentment. It did not take long before the name of a fugitive prisoner began to surface. His name was Jess Hunter, a black man who had escaped custody not long before the incident. For many who were eager to believe the worst, Hunter seemed the perfect candidate to embody their fears, their suspicions, and their desire for swift retribution. There was no evidence linking him to the accusation. No witnesses, no credible testimony, not even the words of the woman at the center of the rumor pointed toward him. And yet, that did not matter. The tide of emotion, once it began, was nearly impossible to stop. Stories, retold again and again, grew sharper and more damning with each repetition. Hunter's name became less a fact and more a symbol of what the white population feared: the loss of control, the challenge to authority, the imagined threat to their safety. The backdrop to this suspicion was already volatile. Missouri, where these events unfolded, was a borderland between North and South, freedom and enslavement, suspicion and change. In such a climate, the faintest spark of rumor could ignite violence. When Hunter's name began to circulate, people clung to it as if it offered a clear resolution, an easy target to rally against. The idea of a fugitive already carried with it a sense of danger, of menace lurking just beyond reach. And those who sought vengeance needed little encouragement to convince themselves that Hunter had to be the one. But what made this rush to judgment particularly tragic was how deliberate the leap was. The authorities did not produce evidence. The community did not wait for facts. Instead, they embraced a narrative because it suited their existing beliefs, their long-held prejudices. The rumor of a white woman harmed was enough to unleash suspicion onto the nearest vulnerable figure, and Hunter fit that role perfectly. This was not justice. It was scapegoating in its purest form. The fear of Jess Hunter became a rallying cry. Men gathered, forming posses, armed with rifles, knives, and the conviction that they were defending their community. The urgency was palpable, as if every hour that Hunter remained free was a threat to their families and their way of life. Yet the urgency was manufactured, stoked by wild storytelling and prejudice rather than fact. Each man who joined the search added weight to the belief that Hunter must be guilty. Each patrol that scoured the countryside transformed rumor into assumed truth. Meanwhile, Hunter himself remained an enigma. His real story, his whereabouts, his actions during that time, were lost beneath the louder, harsher narrative that was being imposed upon him. He was no longer Jess Hunter, a man with his own history and life. He became the fugitive, the attacker, the threat. The humanity was stripped away, replaced with a symbol designed to justify anger and unite the community in a mission of vengeance. This dangerous transformation of one man into a symbol of collective fear demonstrates how quickly rumor can shape reality when prejudice is given free rein. The woman's own words, which denied the assault, were drowned out by the determination of the mob to believe otherwise. It was easier for them to cling to a falsehood than confront the discomfort of truth. By insisting that Hunter was guilty, they could justify their own violence, presenting it as defense of honor and justice, rather than admitting it was hatred and fear that truly drove them. The hysteria surrounding Jess Hunter fed into larger tensions of the era. In the mid-19th century, the United States was fracturing along racial and political lines. Slavery, freedom, and civil rights were matters of fierce dispute, and every local incident could be inflated into a reflection of those national struggles. For the white residents of Missouri, believing that a fugitive black prisoner had committed such an act reinforced their conviction that their authority must be protected at all costs, that any change in the balance of power would bring chaos. As mobs hunted for Hunter, the violence escalated, spilling far beyond the man they claimed to seek. The suspicion attached to him became justification for targeting entire communities. Every black man was suddenly seen through the lens of Hunter's supposed crime, every family viewed with mistrust, every settlement marked as a potential haven for the fugitive. The desire to capture him transformed into a broader assault on a people, proving that Hunter himself was not the true target. He was merely the excuse. The tragedy of Jess Hunter's story lies not only in the wrongful suspicion that attached to him, but also in what that suspicion unleashed. It was never really about one man. It was about the system of belief that demanded a scapegoat to maintain power. His name gave form to the mob's anger, but their violence revealed a deeper truth, that prejudice seeks targets, and when it cannot find them, it creates them. Thus, the figure of Jess Hunter, whether he was near or far, guilty or innocent, became a ghost haunting the landscape. He became the justification for fear, the reason for violence, the symbol of everything the white community claimed to defend against. And in that transformation, the line between rumor and reality dissolved completely, leaving devastation in its wake. What began as whispers about an imagined crime became a storm of rage with Jess Hunter at its center. Not because of what he had done, but because of what others chose to believe. Word spread with alarming speed, and in the charged atmosphere of suspicion, fear, and anger, rumors quickly hardened into a dangerous resolve. The claim that a black fugitive had assaulted a white woman created a spark, and soon that spark ignited a fury among many white residents in nearby towns. Rather than seeking the truth, large groups of men gathered together, their emotions driven by prejudice and long-standing resentment, forming what they called posses. These were not orderly searches guided by justice, but rather overwhelming displays of force. Hundreds of white men, some armed with rifles and shotguns, descended upon the small community of Rosewood, intent on finding someone to blame. Their numbers grew as word spread from one settlement to the next, creating an intimidating presence that loomed over the quiet homes of black families who had lived there for generations. The men who made up these posses were not interested in evidence or fairness. They came with suspicion already fixed in their minds, and their actions soon turned from searching to terrorizing. Black residents were confronted on roads, pulled from their homes, and held at gunpoint as accusations flew. People were beaten, threatened, and forced to endure humiliations while trying desperately to protect themselves and their loved ones. The air was filled with tension, and each passing hour seemed to tighten the noose around the community. For the families of Rosewood, many of whom had known nothing but hard work, church gatherings, and the rhythms of rural life, the sudden invasion of hostile outsiders was terrifying. As night fell, the situation grew even more volatile. Lanterns and torches lit the faces of the posses as they marched through the settlement, shouting demands and forcing residents into the open. They insisted that someone had to pay for what had happened in Sumner, and they were determined to find scapegoats regardless of whether those they accused had any connection to the alleged crime. The law was nearly absent, and even when a sheriff or deputy appeared, their presence did little to calm the chaos. Some even tolerated or ignored the violence, unwilling or unable to stop the crowds that surged with anger. Black residents of Rosewood tried desperately to hold on to a sense of safety. Many gathered together, whispering prayers and planning ways to protect their families. Others attempted to flee into the dense forests and swamps nearby, where they hoped the wilderness might shield them from the wrath of the mobs. But leaving was perilous. Posses patrolled the roads and fields, blocking many escape routes. Every attempt at flight carried the risk of capture, and capture often meant cruelty. The once peaceful surroundings of rosewood pine trees, dirt roads, and quiet cottages were suddenly overshadowed by fear and violence. As the community became the target of suspicion it could not dispel, the frenzy of the posses fed on itself. One accusation led to another, and soon rumors multiplied beyond control. Stories of conspiracies and plots were invented on the spot, each one reinforcing the belief that the entire black community must somehow be complicit in a crime they had nothing to do with. Innocent men, women, and children found themselves trapped in a nightmare, where their very existence seemed to be treated as evidence of guilt. The logic of the mob was simple and terrifying. Someone had to be punished, and any black resident of Rosewood could be that someone. The brutality of these confrontations was not only physical but psychological. Families were torn apart as loved ones were detained. Houses were searched and ransacked, and livelihoods destroyed. For those who remained in Rosewood, each day brought new uncertainty. Would their homes still stand by nightfall? Would their families survive another day of raids and threats? The weight of injustice pressed down heavily, leaving scars that went far beyond the immediate violence. Despite the overwhelming fear, there were moments of quiet resilience. Some families worked together to hide the most vulnerable children, the elderly, and women sending them into the woods under cover of darkness, guided by the faint light of the moon. Others turned to allies in neighboring communities, hoping that a few sympathetic voices might offer shelter or a way out. Yet for most, Rosewood had become a trap, surrounded by hostility and suspicion on every side. The image of hundreds of men scouring the town, shouting, kicking in doors, and dragging residents from their homes, remains one of the most haunting memories of that week. It was not merely a search for one individual, as had first been claimed. It became a campaign of intimidation against an entire community, built on the foundation of prejudice and fueled by anger. Each act of violence or cruelty deepened the wound, transforming Rosewood from a thriving, hopeful settlement into a place marked by terror and despair. For the people living through those days, survival was not about justice or fairness, but about enduring long enough to see the storm pass. Parents clutched their children tightly, whispering reassurances they themselves barely believed, while neighbors exchanged desperate glances, silently acknowledging the shared burden of their fate. And as the posses continued their sweep, the reality set in that this was not simply a temporary raid, but the beginning of something far more devastating. The siege of Rosewood had begun, and with it, the unraveling of a community that had once stood as a symbol of black independence and strength. What had started with the suspicion of a single fugitive had grown into a sweeping campaign against innocent families, driven by fear, rumor, and hatred. And though the residents fought to endure, they were now caught in the shadow of forces far greater than themselves, forces that would leave their town forever changed. The tension in Rosewood had already reached a dangerous peak when the focus shifted onto one of the town's most respected figures. A skilled blacksmith whose trade and craftsmanship had made him a central part of daily life in the community. His forge was a place where people gathered not just to mend tools or shoe horses but also to share stories, exchange news, and find a sense of stability amid the growing chaos. He was known as a man of dignity, someone whose quiet strength and ability to provide for his neighbors gave him a standing of both respect and trust. Yet in moments when fear and anger overcame reason, even a man of such stature could become a target. Rumors spread that he had provided shelter or aid to the fugitive everyone claimed to be hunting, though no proof existed, and in truth, no one cared to find any. What mattered was finding someone to punish, someone upon whom the weight of collective rage could fall. The mob descended upon him with the fury of people who had already decided his fate. They did not see a craftsman, a father, or a neighbor who had lived peacefully among them for years. Instead, they saw a convenient symbol, a scapegoat for frustrations that had less to do with the alleged crime and more to do with resentment that had simmered for generations. He was accused in the open, branded guilty without the chance to defend himself, and dragged away in front of those who knew him best. For the black families who watched, powerless to intervene, the horror was not just in the violence, but in the terrible realization that their humanity meant nothing to those who now acted as judge, jury, and executioner. As they brutalized him, the act was framed as punishment, as if they were carrying out some twisted form of justice, though in reality it was little more than cruelty masked in the language of order. They ignored the fact that his hands, once steady and skilled in shaping iron into useful tools, were now bound and unable to resist. They ignored the pleas from voices that tried to reason with them. In their frenzy, the mob was determined to make an example of him, to demonstrate that any form of perceived defiance, even imagined, would be met with a terrible cost. When the ordeal reached its peak, they ended his life in a way meant to instill fear, ensuring that everyone left behind would remember not just the loss of a neighbor, but also the message it carried, that survival required silence, submission, and invisibility. The act was not simply about the man himself, it was about the entire community he represented. By destroying someone so respected, the mob sought to break the spirit of Rosewood's people, to remind them that no matter how skilled, how decent, or how valuable they were, they would never be safe from the tide of hatred rising around them. For those who had gathered, the sight lingered painfully, itching itself into memory. Mothers shielded the eyes of their children, yet the sounds and the terror could not be hidden. Families clung to one another, knowing that if a man of such standing could be taken and treated this way, then none of them were truly beyond reach. Fear became a weight that pressed upon every household. The blacksmith's forge, once filled with the rhythmic clanging of hammer on iron, now stood silent, a haunting reminder of how quickly a life could be extinguished and how fragile a sense of security really was. His death rippled outward, deepening the despair that already hung over Rosewood. It was not simply the loss of one man, but the deliberate erasure of what he represented. His craftsmanship had been a symbol of resilience. His presence a reminder that hard work and skill could carve out a measure of dignity in a hostile world. With his absence, that fragile hope dimmed, replaced by the stark knowledge that even those who contributed most visibly to the fabric of society could be cast aside when prejudice demanded it. In the days that followed, his name was spoken in hushed tones, carried with grief and anger, but also with a deepening awareness that the forces arrayed against them would stop at nothing. Some whispered of leaving immediately, of fleeing into the swamps or making the long journey north where stories promised safer ground. Others clung to their homes, unwilling to abandon land that had been fought for, tended by their families for decades. Yet all knew that the loss of the blacksmith marked a turning point. What had begun as a search for one man had grown into something far larger, a campaign of terror designed to strip Rosewood of its strength and dignity. This single act was both personal and communal, devastating a family and shattering the wider community's fragile sense of safety. For his loved ones, it meant an unfillable absence, a chair at the table that would never again be occupied, the silence of a voice that once carried warmth and reassurance. For Rosewood, it meant the collapse of one of its cornerstones, a grim signal that the days ahead would be filled with danger. Each family now understood that survival depended not on fairness or truth but on chance, timing, and the fragile hope that they could escape notice. The story of the blacksmith's death became one of the most haunting chapters in the tragedy of Rosewood, not only because of the brutality with which it unfolded but because of the cruel irony that someone who had built so much with his hands was destroyed by those who sought only to tear down. His legacy, though silenced in that moment, lived on in the memory of survivors who carried his name and his story forward, testifying to the senselessness of what had been lost. It was a stark illustration of how unchecked hatred consumes not only its victims, but also the humanity of those who perpetrate it, leaving behind scars that endure for generations. In the shadows that followed his death, Rosewood itself began to unravel. Families who once believed they might weather the storm now knew that there was no safety left in staying. His lynching was more than an act of violence, it was a declaration that the community itself was under siege. For those who survived, it became impossible to forget that the mob's fury had claimed not just a man, but also the fragile hope of a town trying to hold on to its place in the world. The Carrier family had long been a part of Rosewood, their presence woven into the daily rhythms of the small town. Sarah Carrier, strong-willed and steadfast, was known for her resilience and her devotion to her children. She carried herself with the quiet dignity of someone who had endured a lifetime of hardship and who had no intention of surrendering her home or her family to fear. Her son, Sylvester, shared her unyielding spirit. He had grown up watching his mother fight against the small injustices of everyday life, and he had inherited from her both a fiery sense of pride and a determination to stand his ground. Their household, filled with the chatter of children and the warmth of family, became a fragile sanctuary as the tide of violence swept across Rosewood. When rumors spread and tension spiraled, Sarah and Sylvester understood what was coming. They had seen the mobs gathering, heard the angry shouts echoing through the night, and knew that their home, like the homes of so many neighbors, would be targeted. Yet rather than flee into the woods as others had, they chose to stay. For Sarah, leaving her home meant abandoning the very foundation of her family's life, the roof under which generations had been raised, the place where her children felt safe. For Sylvester, it was about more than walls and possessions. It was about standing firm against those who sought to erase his existence and the legacy of his people. Together, mother and son prepared themselves for the confrontation they knew was inevitable. The first sound of approaching footsteps cut through the darkness, followed by the harsh murmur of voices outside. Windows rattled as stones struck the wooden siding, and the children inside huddled close to their mother. Sarah whispered reassurances, her calm voicing the fear she carried deep inside. She knew the mob outside was larger, stronger, and armed with hatred that could not be reasoned with, but she also knew she could not let her children see her falter. Her resolve became their anchor, her steady presence a shield against the storm crashing around them. Sylvester took his place by the door, his body tense, ready to defend the threshold that marked the line between safety and chaos. The assault on the house came suddenly, a roar of sound and fury breaking against the fragile walls. Shots rang out in the night, the air thick with smoke and splinters as bullets tore through wood. Sylvester fired back, driven not by anger but by a desperate need to protect his family. Each pull of the trigger was an act of defiance, refusal to surrender to terror. Sarah stood by him, her face set with determination, her voice urging him on even as danger closed in. The children, wide-eyed and trembling, clung to one another in the shadows, bearing witness to a nightmare that would forever mark their lives. The house, once a haven, had become a battleground, its walls echoing with the clash of wills. In this, Sarah's life was cut short. A bullet struck her as she shielded her children, and the matriarch who had held her family together with such strength and grace fell. Her final moments were not those of fear, but of fierce protection, her last thoughts surely on the young lives she had devoted herself to nurturing. Sylvester, enraged and heartbroken, fought on with a ferocity that surprised even those who sought to bring him down. He refused to abandon the stand he and his mother had taken, even as the odds grew impossibly heavy against him. In a final standoff, Sylvester's resistance came to an end, his life claimed in the struggle that had defined him. For the children, the aftermath was a silence more chilling than the violence itself. The home they had known was shattered, its walls scarred by fire and gunfire, its warmth extinguished. They were left to piece together fragments of memory, to carry within them the trauma of what they had seen, the image of their mother's defiance, their brother's courage, the sounds of the mob outside, all of it etched permanently into their hearts. They would grow up under the shadow of loss, forced to rebuild their lives in the absence of those who had fought so bravely to protect them. Yet even in this tragedy, the story of Sarah and Sylvester carried with it a quiet power. Their decision to resist was not only an act of self-preservation but a declaration of humanity in the face of cruelty. They had chosen to defend their dignity, their family, and their home, even knowing the cost might be their lives. In their courage, they left behind a legacy that spoke louder than the violence that ended them. Their story became part of the larger tapestry of Rosewood, a reminder of the strength and resilience that lived within its people even as their town was consumed by flames. The children, though scarred, were also living testaments to that resilience. They carried forward the memory of their mother's unshakable will and their brother's fierce defense, keeping alive the truth of what had happened when others tried to bury it. And as the years passed, the tragedy of Rosewood was remembered not only for the destruction and loss, but also for the courage of families like the Carriers, who in the face of overwhelming fear, chose to stand their ground and affirm their place in the world. In the days that followed the initial spark of violence, the atmosphere in Rosewood shifted from fear to unrestrained devastation. The small town, once defined by its quiet routines, its churches, schools, and family gatherings, became a target of destruction carried out by armed groups who descended with the intent to erase it from existence. Homes that had sheltered generations of families were set ablaze, one after another, the flames consuming not only wooden walls and familiar rooms, but also the sense of safety and belonging that residents had worked so hard to build. Smoke rose high into the sky, blotting out the sun, a grim signal that the world of Rosewood was being systematically dismantled. As the fires spread, the violence escalated. Residents were hunted through the woods, forced to abandon the very ground they had cultivated with sweat and perseverance. Entire families scattered into the swamps, clutching only what they could carry, many fleeing with children in their arms and nothing but instinct to guide them to safety. The relentless pursuit left behind shattered lives, as men, women, and children became victims of unchecked brutality. The exact number of lives lost may never be known, but accounts from survivors and later investigations suggest that the toll reached far higher than what was admitted at the time. Dozens, perhaps over 100, were killed, their names and stories left to whispers, because few dared to preserve them openly in a society that had no interest in honoring their memory. Adding to this tragedy was the way it was portrayed to the outside world. Newspapers of the era, instead of shedding light on the suffering of the innocent, framed the events in distorted ways. Headlines painted the massacre as a race war, a phrase designed not only to sensationalize but also to shift blame onto the very victims who had been forced into flight. This narrative suited the prejudices of the time, allowing wider society to look away without confronting the injustice that had unfolded in Florida. By labeling the destruction as a mutual conflict rather than a targeted act of terror, these publications gave cover to those who had orchestrated the violence and left the survivors to face suspicion rather than sympathy. The survivors themselves bore wounds far beyond the physical. Families that had once enjoyed stability and independence were now broken, dispersed, and stripped of their property. Generations lost homes, land, and the fragile sense of progress that had been carved out after decades of hardship. Children who witnessed their world collapse overnight carried those memories for the rest of their lives, often in silence, because speaking of Rosewood was too dangerous in the years that followed. Some families adopted new identities, blending into other towns or moving north, hiding their connection to Rosewood as if erasing it from memory could somehow protect them from further harm. The burning of Rosewood was not only an assault on individuals, but also an attack on the very idea that black communities could thrive independently in the face of systemic obstacles. Rosewood had been a place of self-reliance, where families owned land, operated businesses, and supported one another. Its destruction sent a chilling message to surrounding areas. Success could be punished, and entire towns could be eliminated under the guise of order. In this sense, the massacre was both deeply personal and tragically symbolic, embodying the larger struggle faced by Black Americans in the early 20th century. In the aftermath, silence became a survival strategy. Official records minimized the extent of the killings. Property deeds disappeared, and the voices of survivors were drowned out by the dominant narrative that insisted the violence had been mutual. It took decades for the truth to resurface, carried by the testimony of those who, lit and leaf, decided to break the silence and reclaim their history. They spoke of the fear, the fire, the loss of loved ones, and the way society conspired to bury their story. Their courage in telling these memories not only preserved the legacy of Rosewood, but also challenged the distortions that had endured for generations. The destruction of Rosewood cannot be seen as an isolated episode. It fits into a broader pattern of similar acts of terror across the United States during this period, when thriving black communities were subjected to violence and displacement. From Tulsa to Rosewood, These events served as stark reminders that progress could be undone in an instant if it threatened the entrenched systems of inequality. Yet the resilience of survivors and their descendants ensured that the memory would not be erased forever. They carried forward the stories, not only as a record of pain but also as a testament to endurance. To revisit Rosewood's destruction is to understand the profound consequences of both violence and silence. It forces us to recognize the deliberate erasure of communities, the manipulation of truth by those in power, and the resilience of those who, against all odds, preserved the fragments of their past. The story of Rosewood, once nearly forgotten, now stands as a cautionary tale of how history can be twisted and how justice delayed is justice denied. It is also a call to honor those whose voices were silenced, to listen to the echoes of their struggle, and to ensure that such devastation is remembered not as a hidden shame, but as an essential chapter in the larger story of America. Rosewood burned not only in flames but also in memory. Yet through the survival of testimony and the persistence of truth, it remains alive today as a reminder of what was lost and of the strength required to face the past with honesty. The distorted image once printed in newspapers has been replaced, slowly and painfully, by the voices of survivors and their descendants. Through them, Rosewood is no longer just a story of destruction. It is also one of remembrance, resilience, and the enduring demand for truth. When the smoke finally cleared over the quiet Florida settlement, the silence was more telling than any headline could capture. The once thriving community of Rosewood, built with determination and pride by black families who had carved out a life of self-sufficiency, was gone. Its homes lay in ruins, its church and school reduced to ashes, and its people scattered in every direction, seeking safety in neighboring towns or vanishing into anonymity. What made the tragedy even more haunting was not only the scale of destruction, but the unsettling reality that no one among the perpetrators faced justice. The authorities, who had been quick to respond when rumors first spread, turned away when evidence of mass violence lay plainly before them. For the survivors, this abandonment was almost as devastating as the violence itself, for it confirmed that the very system meant to protect them was unwilling to do so. The survivors carried with them not only physical scars but the heavy burden of silence. They had to leave behind homes they had worked for decades to build, businesses that had sustained families, and churches that had anchored their community. Some fled to cities like Gainesville or Ocala, where they blended into new neighborhoods, never speaking of Rosewood for fear of attracting unwanted attention or rekindling old hostilities. Others drifted farther, their names lost in census records, their stories reduced to whispers told only within families. What was once a place of hope became a ghost town, erased from maps and memory, as if by erasing its name the pain might somehow be forgotten. Newspapers at the time framed the destruction as the conclusion of a so-called race conflict, as though two equal sides had clashed in some inevitable struggle. Yet the truth, known all too well by those who escaped, was that Rosewood had not been the scene of a war but of an unchecked rampage. The absence of any arrests underscored the complicity of institutions in allowing the tragedy to vanish into the background of history. Justice was not even attempted, as if the loss of black lives and livelihoods was unworthy of legal redress. The silence of the courts and the inaction of law enforcement created a wound that remained open for generations, a reminder of how fragile security could be when prejudice outweighed fairness. For those who once called Rosewood home, survival meant more than escaping immediate danger. It meant reshaping their identities, guarding their memories, and teaching their children resilience without passing down the full weight of what had been endured. Families often avoided recounting the events in detail, worried that speaking the truth would bring shame, danger, or disbelief. This imposed silence gave the tragedy an almost mythic quality, a painful chapter that lived on in fragments of stories overheard at family gatherings, in the sadness of elders who looked away when Rosewood was mentioned, or in the quiet determination of descendants who worked harder to prove themselves in towns that still carried unspoken biases. The land where Rosewood once stood slowly returned to wilderness. Trees and vines covered the ruins, as if nature itself was determined to conceal the evidence of what had happened. To passersby, it was just another stretch of Florida pine forest, unremarkable and quiet, but beneath the soil were the remnants of homes, businesses, and dreams, testaments to a community that had once flourished despite the odds. Rosewood became a ghost story without ghosts, a place erased not by time alone, but by the willful forgetting of a society that preferred not to confront its own complicity. Yet memory has a way of surviving even when silence seems absolute. Survivors carried fragments of Rosewood with them, recipes, songs, ways of worship, and the deep belief in education and self-reliance that had defined the town. These fragments, though small, became threads woven into new communities, where the descendants of Rosewood worked quietly to rebuild their lives. Their resilience itself was a form of resistance, a refusal to let the story end with loss. Though Rosewood as a town ceased to exist, the spirit of those who had lived there could not be completely extinguished. The absence of justice, however, loomed like a shadow every time survivors passed a courthouse or saw deputies on patrol. They were reminded that the system had abandoned them. This loss of trust left scars that shaped how families viewed authority for decades. For many, the lesson was clear. Protection had to be found within one's own community, because outside forces could not be relied upon. That sense of vulnerability, carried forward, became part of the generational memory, influencing how children and grandchildren navigated a world where safety could never be taken for granted. As years turned to decades, the memory of Rosewood might have been completely erased if not for the determination of a few who refused to let silence have the final word. Survivors, when older and nearing the end of their lives, began to share their stories with trusted family members. They spoke in voices weighed with pain but also with resolve, wanting the truth to be known, not for vengeance, but for recognition. Their courage planted seeds that historians, journalists, and activists later nurtured, ensuring that Rosewood would not vanish entirely into obscurity. Looking back, the story of Rosewood is not only about the destruction of a town but also about the endurance of its people. Though no white perpetrators were arrested and the town ceased to exist as a black community, the legacy of Rosewood survived in the determination of descendants to honor their ancestors and reclaim the memory that was nearly lost. It is a reminder that even in the face of erasure, history has a way of resurfacing, carried forward by those unwilling to let injustice remain hidden forever. The story of Rosewood lingers because it embodies both tragedy and resilience. Its destruction revealed how prejudice, unchecked, can obliterate not just lives but entire communities. Yet its memory endures as a quiet testament to survival, a story once buried now told with clarity, ensuring that the silence that followed the flames will not define it forever. Rosewood may no longer exist as it once did, but through remembrance, it speaks across time, urging future generations to confront truth rather than hide from it. As the decades passed, the silence surrounding Rosewood lingered like an unhealed wound, buried under layers of shame, fear, and willful forgetting. For years, newspapers rarely spoke of it. Families whispered about it only behind closed doors, and many survivors carried their memories quietly, too traumatized to pass them down in detail to the next generation. But time has a way of uncovering what is hidden, and the truth could not remain buried forever. Witnesses began to speak. Survivors, their voices cracked with age yet sharpened by clarity, revealed what had really happened in those cold January days of 1923. And later, historians pieced together the fragments, showing that the violence did not emerge from some sudden eruption of chaos, but from a deliberate deception. At the center of it was a false accusation, born out of the desperate need of one woman to conceal her secret relationship, to shield herself, She created a story that turned suspicion away from her personal life and toward an innocent man. That story spread quickly, igniting old prejudices and fueling resentment that had been simmering in the shadows for years. It was not truth that destroyed Rosewood. It was the collision of racism and lies. What followed was not only a tragedy for the people who lost their homes, their families, and their futures, but also a tragedy for history itself, an entire community built on resilience, dignity, and hard-earned prosperity was erased because of fear and hatred. The timber homes and churches that once stood tall became ash. The laughter of children who once filled the air was silenced. What remained was only smoke, grief, and silence. Rosewood ceased to exist not because its people lacked courage or unity, but because a system that should have protected them looked away. No white perpetrators were arrested. The families who had fought so hard to claim a small piece of the American dream were left with nothing but the clothes on their backs and the memories they carried in their hearts. Rosewood's disappearance from the map symbolized not just the destruction of a town, but the erasure of history itself. And yet, the memory of Rosewood endures. Survivors and their descendants refused to let the truth vanish, and their determination eventually brought justice in the form of recognition and reparations. In the 1990s, the state of Florida finally acknowledged what had happened, offering compensation to some of the survivors, though no amount of money could undo the pain or restore the lives that were lost. It was a step toward healing, a recognition that the silence had gone on too long. More importantly, it was an affirmation that the truth matters, that even when history is painful, it must be told. The story of Rosewood is not only about the cruelty of the past, but about the power of memory, resilience, and truth. It teaches us that hatred can destroy in moments what generations build with love and effort. But it also shows that even when lies try to bury justice, the voices of those who survived, and the dedication of those who remember, can bring the truth back into the light. The people of Rosewood were more than victims. They were builders, parents, dreamers, and neighbors. And while their homes were taken, their legacy continues to inspire. As we close this chapter tonight, let Rosewood's story remind us that history is not only about the past, it is also a mirror for the present. It asks us to question how we treat one another, how we protect truth, and how we honor the communities that came before us. Every listener here has a role to play in keeping memory alive. By learning, by remembering, and by sharing, we help ensure that tragedies born of lies and hate are not repeated. Thank you for joining us on this journey into the forgotten past. If this story moved you, please consider liking this video, subscribing to the channel, and sharing it with others, so that together we can continue uncovering the truths that history tried to hide. Your support allows us to bring more stories like this to light and to give voice to those who were silenced. And now, as the night draws to a close, I want to leave you with a wish for peace. May you carry with you not only the weight of Rosewood's lessons, but also the strength of its resilience. May the memory of those who endured inspire you to seek truth, kindness, and justice in your own life.